This is Robert L. Cruz again, Eric's Air Force 05, with an interesting story about F-100s and an event that happened and ended up at Malta in the Mediterranean. This was in the summer of 1968. I was a member of the 48 TAC Fighter Wing, 493rd Squadron, and we had deployed to Wheelis Air Force Base, Libya, for some additional training, gunnery training, air-to-air training, a little bit of formation and missile flying. But anyway, it was a 2-week deployment. And we completed it, and there had been a little bit of interesting story when we did air-to-air. I'm not going to get into that in too much detail, but the airplane that I had available to me that I was flying every day, in the air-to-air, I had a problem as I rolled off the perch and rolled in, got cleared to shoot 20 millimeter. I got a compressor stall every time I added power in the airplane. And for 2 days, it would do the same thing. And then each day, second day, I asked maintenance at night to try and see if they could duplicate the problem and maybe trim the fuel control, see what was making it compressor stall. Well, anyway, that night we went to the club. We had a small dinner, a couple drinks, and we planned a brief for deployment or return to Aviano, Italy, on a Saturday morning, August 15, 1968. We briefed, had a very thorough briefing. Flight lead was Dean Stickle. Anyway, we covered our briefing, and there was quite a bit of good information. And we took off about 7 o'clock. It was a 4-ship. I'm sorry, let me stop. 4-ship, and 3 of us were squadron members, and a 4th member was moving or positioning an airplane for the 493rd Squadron to Aviano. He was a member of the Wheelis organization. So we briefed and wrapped that up, got to our airplanes, normal starts, normal takeoffs, line up for 4-ship. Lead element goes first, rejoin, and we're climbing out over the Mediterranean northbound. And we had a clearance that basically wanted us to go to 31,000 feet, flight level 310. I'm in number 3, I'm Viper 97, and the Wheelis guy was number 4, Don Dixon. Anyway, we're standard departure, everything routine, TAC formation, passing 25,000, and they reassigned us to 33, flight level 330. And I noticed I was a little bit wide, a little bit high on the lead element, and I made a decision to add a little power and move closer to the lead element and get a better position. I added about 2% N1, and the airplane engine and the airplane went bang, bang, bang. 3 blows, and it got real quiet. The engine blew up and went through the side of the fuselage, and I had an instant spraying of fog in the cockpit. And I thought initially, mentally, it was a fire. I'm on fire. But it turned out later, when the engine destroyed itself and it came through the side of the case, it went through the oil tank and it sprayed oil, synthetic oil, through the air cycle machine, and it pumped it into the cabin and to maintain the port, of course, initially 10,000 feet. But anyway, and it got real quiet. And I pushed the button and I said, Viper 97 just flamed out, and I'm turning right. I'm heading for Malta. And the lead made some other calls, and we all turned, and of course the tanks came off. They had fuel still in the tanks, the 330-gallon drops, 335. And the airplane was, I couldn't believe how quiet it was. The airplane was flying. I could steer it. I slowed down to 220 knots to have enough speed to keep the rat going, and I suddenly realized that I had only 1,200 pounds on the hydraulic system, which means the rat is powering flight controls. And I'm heading for the island, and it was a pretty nice day, but as I headed eastbound, about 080, I saw clouds, lower deck clouds, where I was heading. But anyway, we made some radio changes, and Malta Control said we were 41 miles west of Malta, and I was flying the airplane. I left the inverter on because I needed to read the hydraulic pressure from the rat, which was only 1,200 pounds, instead of a normal 2,500-pound system. As I got closer to the island, I still had radio. We had a few radio channel changes, and I have some documents that cover everything, channels and so forth, in the report. But as I got closer to the island, I was still probably about 15 miles away, we had a lower ceiling, a lower deck of 6/10 cloud, and we'd briefed that one of the alternate fuels would be RAF Luqua on Malta. And I thought I had a pretty good chance to make it. And as I got closer to the island, the clouds got thicker and more dense. I had 6/10 coverage, and I had trouble seeing even the water a little bit. And I got the edge of the island, but I had no real visual connection with RAF Luqua. I'm coming down the coast, and I'm mentally preparing for maybe getting in the water, bailing or ejecting. And as I came down the coast, and I still couldn't find the airport, Luqua, because I'd heard radio calls, the runway was 06, but that was the heading I was on, and the wind was not a real problem. It's 3 knots of wind. I got closer to the island, I started thinking I may have to punch out. I'll stay along the coast. And as I got further in, suddenly in the breaks in the clouds, I was passing about 6,000 feet. I saw a big runway. It looked like a big sack runway, but it would kind of fade in and out because of the breaks in the clouds. And I said, it's time for SFO. As I got further away or further down, I realized, okay, I'm going to have to land almost the direction I'm going. The runway was runway 6, and I crossed over near the end of the runway, I think, or a little past it. I was still clean, but below the recommended SFO level of 10,000 feet. So I made a left turn, and I'm still doing 230, 220, maintaining control. And I lost the radio just before that turn. I'm now also, shortly after the radio, the low voltage cutoff, battery cutoff, dumped all the electronic buses. I had no electric systems. All I had was rat hydraulic pressure to steer, and I had to pull a lanyard to get the wheels down. I had no steering, flaps, speed brakes, all that stuff when you lose everything. I turned downwind, and I went into the clouds at about 5,500 feet. And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't have any instruments. I may lose control in the weather. But luckily, I broke out about just under 5,000 feet. And I was going pretty fast, still doing 230. And I pulled the lanyard to get the wheels down, and they came down. I really had no electrics. I didn't have any green lights. Everything was down. But anyway, the airplane wiggled a little bit and kind of thumped around, so I had to assume the wheels were coming down. And then, since I was going a little faster, I forgot that I'm going to be making a wider turn to the base leg from low key. So I started the turn and I thought, no, I'm in the clouds, I'll leave it alone. And I broke out of the clouds at about 3,900 feet, 3,600 feet. And now I realized I was overshooting the final approach to runway 6. So I thought, I've got to get down and I'm overshooting. So I slipped the airplane. And that caused a problem. When I stood on the rudder and banked the airplane, the control stick locked up. I had no control over the airplane. And I thought, Kingfish, you're going to die. The airplane luckily was in a slip, bringing me towards the center line of the runway that I was trying to land on. And I remember them in our ground briefing before I left, they had a safe barrier at the airport. And I had kind of a good feeling that everything would be okay. Well, my mental picture of a safe barrier is kind of what the Air Force called an MA-1A, about a 4-foot, 3-foot tennis net across the end of the runway. Well, as I got closer and I was slipping towards the center line of the runway, as I got closer and I was in the overrun, about 400 feet above the overrun, I saw 2 large poles that were almost the size of telephone poles. And I found out later that the safe barrier is large poles with a 1/2-inch cable and a big net across the end of the runway to catch transport category airplanes and keep them from going in the ocean that I had just come over. And off the end, there was a big cliff about a 1/2 mile from the end of the runway. So I ended up, because of the slip, I ended up clearing it to the left of the poles, and I got it over on the runway. And of course, I didn't remember how long the runway was, but I got it down about 3,500 feet down on a 7,500-foot runway. And I got it on the runway in the center, and I pumped up the emergency brakes. I'd already lost all the electrics from the low voltage, but I had emergency braking, and I started pumping on the brakes. I got them pumped up, and then I noticed I'm still rolling down the runway. I'd punched the hook. I got to pull the chute, parachute, the drag chute, and the drag chute didn't blossom all the way. It candlesticked. It whipped around, and I thought, oh my gosh. But I finally got it to come out at about midfield. And I'm still doing about 110 knots at this point, and I had about 3,600 feet left on the runway. And it was pretty bumpy runway, and I was using braking action to maintain directional control. And anyway, I saw the end of the runway coming, and I thought, oh, I'm not going to be able to stop it. I got back on the brakes. I went into the overrun, and I aimed for some approach lighting, thinking they would slow me down. And sure enough, I hit the first or second light with the nose wheel, and the nose collapsed. Now sliding across the desert, aiming for lights, and I saw this big, I thought, cyclone fence. And I thought I had this feeling of success. This fence will stop me. Well, the airplane now, with everything gone, was probably down to about 24,000 pounds. And I headed for the fence, and I aimed for the center, and I went through the fence like it was toilet paper. Just bang through the fence and across the service road and off another little small brick area about 2 feet high, and the airplane landed in a small farmer's field stopped on the other side with a big cloud of dust. I stopped. I thought, there's so much dust, I couldn't see any blue sky. I thought, I'm below the bottom of the earth, or below the earth. I must be maybe in hell. And I blew the canopy. I made sure all the switches were off, and I stepped over the side of the airplane. I disconnected my chute and everything, and I stepped right off over the side onto the ground. In the meantime, the Brits were on their way in a Jeep, called, a British Jeep, and they were startled to see me walking towards them. They didn't think I would survive. Anyway, I got in the Jeep and I told them I'm lucky, I feel good, I had no injuries. And they took me to the base of the tower and I ran up the stairs. I ran up about 40 stairs and I opened the door to go in and suddenly I had a feeling, I guess the shock was getting to me, that I was getting weak, but I grabbed the microphone, they let me talk and talk to the rest of the flight that had been watching this whole drill flying around adjacent to me and in the distance. And I indicated that I'm okay. We're going, notified the folks at Lake and Heath that I went off the end, I'm okay, the airplane's broken. I later then, 10 or 15 minutes later, went down below the tower, went into operations, and I made a call to our command post at Lake and Heath, telling them I'm down at Malta, I'm okay, the airplane's broken. And they said, we've already got the word out, and the T-39 with the wing commander and DM, director of maintenance, is on it's getting ready to leave. Stand by, they'll be down there in 2 hours. And so I went down in the basement with ops telling the story. And I didn't say anything, but as I went through the fence, there was a British airman and his wife pushing an English pram along the service road that I crossed. They were just to the left of the left wingtip, probably about 50 feet from the wingtip, and I thought I might have hit them or had the fence hit them. But anyway, they were okay. They were smart enough. They looked and they pushed their pram and went down on the road, but there was no injury. No, they were actually probably 70 feet from where the wingtip went across the road. I was later sent over to the British flight surgeon. This was a Saturday morning, and he wanted to talk to me, and he checked my blood pressure and see if I was okay. And we were talking, and this was an interesting event now. The British medical people said there's something, a gentleman outside the door that you need to see, Doc, and he dismissed me. And he went out and he came back in about 3 minutes and he said, Bob Cruz, he didn't call my last name, but Bob, there's a guy out here that you need to meet. And I went out with him and he introduced me to this little, maybe 19-year-old British airman in shorts. And he was shaking so badly that he couldn't shake my hand. He couldn't even touch my hand. It was rattling. And he was the guy, the airman that was close to you going through the fence. So I think he has some great grandchildren stories to tell about an F-100 at Malta almost wiping him out. Anyway, the T-39 came in about 2 hours later, and I was still there in my flying suit, feeling good. The only injury I got was a little bang on my left shin, which was black and blue the next morning, where my foot came off the rudder pedal. But anyway, as the door opened, Colonel Cab Brannan, a marvelous wing commander, came off the airplane. Of course, I saluted him, and he said the first words out of him, Bob, are you okay? I was on final approach, and I was still high and slipping to the center of the runway, and I found by slipping the airplane, the nose of the airplane was around, and I wasn't getting much air through to spin the little rat, giving me hydraulic pressure. And suddenly I tried to level the wings as I was getting closer to the ground, and the controls froze. I had no control over the airplane. And I thought, oh my gosh, Kingfish, you're going to strike the planet. just the stability of the airplane. The nose started swinging around at about 150 feet, 100 feet plus, and I got lined up parallel to the center line of the runway, but I was adjacent to the edge of the runway. And as I went by the safe barrier, seeing the large poles, I cleared that, and I finally moved it over to the center of the runway, just about 2,800 feet down the runway, and I got it on the runway at about 160 knots. And then I pumped up the brakes to make sure I had emergency braking. But then I kind of gave up because I was having trouble with directional control. And then I used the brakes intermittently, one at a time, because I wanted to maintain directional control and stay down the center of the runway. And of course, I had pulled the drag chute, but I had a candlestick. And then finally it came out, and I crossed midfield probably with about 3,500 feet to go, going pretty fast. I was still 110, 115 knots when I had 3,500 feet to go. And then, of course, I still was not braking with both feet or both brake pedals being activated simultaneously. And I then, of course, went off the end of the runway and